How's it going? Adam Drake here, and today I'm going to share some information on shock and diff fluid. I was recently asked how often you should change your shock and diff fluid, and that really depends on the level of race you're going to, how serious you're taking your racing. Obviously, if you put fresh shock fluid or diff fluid, it's never going to be a bad thing. The fresher the fluid, the more consistent everything's going to be. But sometimes people maybe go way too long in between servicing their shocks and diffs. And then there's also the flip side of that where people change stuff maybe a little bit more frequently than what is needed. So I will start with the shocks. Typically, we change shock fluid fairly often, especially if you're racing in areas where in the mornings it's cool, in the afternoons the temperature warms up, and then in the evenings it cools down again. You may end up changing your shock oil multiple times throughout the day. Even if you're trying to keep your balance the same, you're kind of chasing the change in weather or ambient temperature. Some guys will have two sets of shocks. They'll have a morning and evening set with a little bit lighter oil, and then a day set of shocks. So again, just depends on the level that you're racing at, and also the size of the event. But as far as normal use goes, say you're someone who just races every Wednesday night or every Friday night, and the weather stays the same for a couple months. You may not need to change your shock oil for a number of races, and the performance and everything will still be great. So something to consider with your shock oil is paying close attention to your shock boots. I see some guys that don't use shock boots at all. For 8-scale racing, that's really, really bad. You should always use shock boots, and you should always pay close attention to your shock boots to make sure that there's no holes. Because if dirt gets inside the boot, or if you're not using boots, that dirt can stick to the bottom of like the seal pack and to the shock shaft, and it will scratch shock shafts. Then the shock shafts that have scratches will tear up the O-rings, and it's just going to make the car not handle as well. The shock fluid's going to get dirty, car's not going to handle as well. So if you're racing in a very consistent environment where the weather's not changing often and your shock boots have no holes, especially like if you're running a bladder shock, you could go a really long time. If it's emulsion, you should always kind of check and rebleed your shocks, especially if the temperature goes up. But normally if the temperature is going up enough, you're also probably going up in oil. So I would say for the average racer, you should be able to go at least probably 3 or 4 weekends without changing your shocks, if again the weather's not changing. If the weather is changing throughout the day, you may change them twice every day that you're at the track. Never going to hurt anything if you want to freshen up the fluid. But again, if there's no rips or tears, you can go quite a while with today's shocks. As far as the diffs go, some guys will go a really, really long time with their diffs. For me, I feel it's not that it's so important that the fluid needs to be brand new in your diffs all the time. It's more of checking and making sure that the outdrive, so most vehicles, the outdrive where it goes through the ring gear or through the diff cup, there will be a little grease groove. That is one of the most important keys to making sure you have a consistent handling car. If you use a really good grease, I use the Mugen premium grease. It's a white kind of lithium style grease, but I've never used another grease that holds up as well as the Mugen grease. You can use Flashpoint makes a black grease. Most of the companies make a black grease that will do a good job. It will protect kind of that in between the outdrive and the ring gear and the diff cup, but the premium grease from Mugen just sticks and stays much better than any other grease I've used. But back to how often you should change or service your diffs. It comes down to the grease you use. Sometimes you'll see, if you're not using a good grease, if you pull the outdrive out and that grease groove is dry, or sometimes it'll almost look like there's like a little bit of rust. That means the diffs are not working properly. You need to be able to have put pressure and force on that outdrive, because you got to figure the drive shaft, suspension, everything's going up and down and moving. So there's force on that outdrive, and it needs to be able to spin and turn free in the cup and the ring gear. If you don't use a good grease, you're going to have to service the diffs more frequently. For me, again, just to be on the safe side of things, I pretty much every weekend of racing, like if I go Friday, Saturday, Sunday race, if I start on Friday, I'm good to go through the weekend. If it's not an important race or I'm just going to practice, obviously you can go considerably longer than that. But again, to make sure that the handling of your car stays super consistent, it's really important to make sure your diffs are fresh. And again, I'm not necessarily concerned with like the silicone oil breaking down. If you're using a good diff fluid like the Mugen fluid or Flashpoint, the fluid a lot of times is good for many, many weeks of racing. And again, just kind of check. If you're taking your diffs apart after 1 3-day weekend of racing and there's still grease built up and everything looks nice, then maybe try going 2 race weekends. I would say for the average guy, they can probably do a month worth of club racing before servicing their diffs. Again, for me, I do it a little bit more frequently, but I just want to make sure everything is consistent from week to week, and that I'm not having any handling problems or inconsistencies. So again, just a little bit of information when or how often you should service your shock and diff fluid. If you enjoyed this video, it would be greatly appreciated if you would like, share, and subscribe.